Hello everybody. I will talk to you today about affective relationships with materiality. So materiality, I mean objects and all kinds of material things around us. And I will start by explaining what are affects and what is affective. Since this is a popular word in different scholarship today, but it seems to be difficult to explain, and many people who use it do not explain it thoroughly. So with affective, I refer to emotional, embodied, or real reactions. So when something is affective, it feels like something. You get a feeling about something, but you don't necessarily know what is it about. So affects and affective things are not always conscious, but they influence our thoughts and actions all the time. And affects do not just come from out of nowhere, but they are culturally constructed. So we tend to have similar kinds of feelings, similar kinds of emotions at certain places, with certain things, with certain situations. And so these are shared, and some theorists say that affects are sticky, so they stick to us. So once somebody has some kind of feeling, other people kind of relate to it, and they start feeling the same, as they know from their own experiences what is it about. But people don't necessarily recognize them consciously or be able to describe them. So this is affective. It's something that is all the time around us, in our bodies and between us. And so this is why I've been interested in studying affective relationship with objects, especially with objects that somehow affect us, influence us, they stick to us and stay with us. And this doesn't mean that they necessarily physically are around us. They might be absent, they might disappear, we might lose them, but they still continue to affect us. And I have here a picture of a love lock that is something really, really kind of concrete. But this is an example of a thing that stays somewhere else than your life, for instance, happens, but it might still stay in your mind. Or the memory of putting it and the situation when putting it might stay with you for long or not. Some of these affective experiences fade away, but certain situations they stay with us. And often the materiality helps us to kind of remember these moments and situations. So affects, they are also connected to memory. And I will tell you a little story about how I got interested in this issue. It all started when I started doing my PhD study. Here's a picture of a young girl who's my grandmother, Elsa is her name. And when I studied anthropology and folklore studies, I understood that there is something interesting in her life and the way that she communicates with me. And then I started recording our quotidian conversations and meetings we had. My grandmother lived really close to me when I was a child. It was easy to just run 500 meters to her place, so she was always there. She was always there when I came from school. She was cooking in our house, and when she was around, of course she did all kinds of just these household things, but she also often took time to sit down with me and tell stories to me about her life. And she told me all kinds of stories, and that continued when I left my childhood home and started studying at the university. When I visited her, she would actually tell me even more. She wanted to share with me more of histories about her life. Of course, also because I became an adult, I started like understanding her stories more, and so I interviewed and audio taped about like 14 hours of her stories. And I noticed that often when she started talking, she started gesturing with her hands, and when she told about her work, she would always like kind of sign and tell me and try to show me what she did. And then there was also another thing. I always saw that somehow she traveled somewhere, and she saw something that I didn't see, like a bygone world, and she was a laborer, but of course also a house mother, but in a working kind of like factory community, and that community has kind of disappeared totally. My father continued working there for a while, but there is still a factory, but those houses around the factory where laborers lived, they no longer exist. All of them have been taken down, and people who work in the factory, they live somewhere else, they come and commute, but there's no such a community as her childhood and youth community was. But Sisi kind of like continued to see it, and there were really few things like left from that place. Some photos maybe, but actually no objects really, nothing. But her hands, they were always like kind of touching something and gesturing something. And so I became very interested in how memory gets embodied, and how you carry things in your life that are disappeared and are no longer exist, but still they continue to affect you. And my grandmother, who I think she worked altogether in the factory maybe like 5 years before she married, and then stayed like 20 years at home, and then again maybe something like 7-8 years in the factory. So she didn't really like do much of that hard labor, but still she always told me about herself as being a kind of like laborer, and she always described her work as being something that you need to learn. Your body needs to learn a rhythm of work. So she worked like somewhere doing really simple things, but like, so she would describe her work as a waltz, like dance. And she told also that there were really few people who could actually learn how to do it, since it had to be quick, and so she described herself as being like a kind of like from her body being a worker, as she handled that all. And then my grandfather, who was a worker in the beginning, he studied and he became a kind of like technician and group leader, or kind of like more like administration in the factory. So he kind of like took a step in the hierarchy to become more like better paid and middle class. But my grandmother always said that she didn't, and that she thinks that she was and still is a worker, and it's because of her body, because her body remembers the work and it cannot be taken away. So this is how I got interested in this like embodiment and affective things, and how we, even though the materiality around us changes, we still carry memories, and that materiality affects us even years later. And then when I did postdoctoral studies, I was a part of a multidisciplinary research group where there were archaeologists and scholars of cultural history and cultural heritage. We studied experiences of people who live in the northern Arctic area of Finland about the Second World War time. And we wanted to know what people think about the fact that there are a lot of material remains still from that time. And we asked the communities and individuals, what should we do with that? What should we do with those places still because they are not officially like cultural heritage sites like patrimonio cultural. They don't like receive the status, they're just there. And we wanted to know also about the histories that people still remember. So there are very few people alive that have like first-hand memories, like who are like witnesses of the Second World War, more like second and third generation. But a lot of them knew about those histories, and a lot of them said that they've been to the sites, and then I interviewed 4 elderly people in the area of Lapland who were indigenous Sami. Sami is an indigenous group that is the only indigenous group in whole Europe that we still have, and who kind of like are having the status of being indigenous. So in their areas, in northern Lapland, there were lots of German troops during the Second World War. Finland was not like intervened or taken by the Germans. Norway was, but Finland had a kind of an allyship with Germany that allowed Germany to come to Finland. So Finland shares a long, like more than 1,000-mile border with Russia. So that time Soviet Union, and so Finland had a war with Soviet Union, and Finland would have lost the war without the German help. Even though we're not that proud of that allyship with Germany, in the end of the war, after we had made a peace treaty with Soviet Union, we had another war, and that was against Germany. And so Finland pushed Germans away to Norway. And when those troops left, there were about 200,000 of German troops in northern Lapland, in an area where there was only 100,000 people. So there were more Germans than Finns there. So they built there a lot of different kinds of like military base and things. So when they left, they burned it all down, and they didn't burn only their things. They built 90% of all houses. They bombed bridges. They smashed railways. They kind of demolished the whole area of Lapland. People didn't die because people were evacuated to southern Finland or to Sweden. So only a few reindeer herders stayed. But when they went back to their own lands, and there were both indigenous Sami and then Finnish people living in the area. When they went back, they found nothing. They just found like burned grounds with lots of war junk. So lots of like shrapnels, scrap metal, like pieces of wood, pieces of bridges and so on. So we wanted to know like also how people there feel about the fact that there isn't anything old left, that their kind of past is gone, and their traditions, especially the kind of like crafts and traditional ways of building house, and everything vanished. They had to kind of start a new way of life, and that was of course a modern way. So they built modern houses instead of traditional one. So we wanted to know how people feel about it, how do they connect with their past when they don't have anything there. So they do connect through materiality, and a lot of people there, especially those who kind of have their own experiences about the time, they have kept things. This image is a piece of artillery that blown apart when Germans burned everything. This was handed to me by one of my informants, an elderly reindeer herder, when we went to the area of former artillery base. And when I made an official interview with him, he wouldn't talk much at all, a little bit. But then he wanted to show me one area where something really tragic happened after the war. One of the boys of the village who was playing there, the kids always play in areas where they shouldn't. He stepped on a mine and died there. So he wanted to show me the place. And then when we went there, we were not able to walk or anything. It was like plain forest. So the reindeer herder took me there by ATV and told me that, girl, put good clothes on. It'll be cold and it'll be far. So we went together, and then he started talking because it was his environment, his landscapes, and then his memories. And he took things to his hand and different kinds of shrapnel and different kinds of like pieces of metal, and he told stories. And then he told about what happened with that boy, and it was really emotional. And he handled this to me saying like, hey, I want you to have a war memory. Officially this would not be legal if we didn't report it, but we did it like, as I work with archaeologists, we told when we are interviewing people what we do and that we might dig something from the ground, and we got a permission from the Finnish state to do it. And officially everything, like all war remains, they belong to Finnish military, so nobody should take it. But you know, Lapland is in the middle of nowhere in the wilderness. A lot of people do go and take things. We were interested on also in finding out what people do with these. So eventually I took this home, and I took it also because I thought that I want to respect the feeling of that person, and I want to remember that place. So for me this is a thing that I often like take into my hand, and with having it in my hand I understand better what I'm doing, and I can kind of relate much more to the experiences of people there. So I think like what Materiality does, often it's really important for both personal but also collective memory. It helps people to connect with past, and it sort of validates the experiences. Since often, especially with marginalized people, there isn't much left about their history, or not much history that would be like written, but they have a lot of history in different kinds of material objects. So it's not like we should treat them with like only respect to, for instance, what is regarded cultural heritage, but we should like treat this materiality as part of some people's lives and their understandings of their everyday life and family history and so on. So I think we should kind of like respect objects too much more, and approach them from the point of emotions, and not only about like facts like who made it where and was it like valuable, but to think about the stories they carry on. And I think it's interesting too that some of the objects that have really interesting stories, when people die, the objects, they stay with us. They stay with other people, but some of the stories kind of like they continue there, but some are forgotten. And the objects may get like new lives and new stories around them. And I think this is also something really important and interesting. Also when we think about like buildings and their owners and what happens to them. So then I will soon start talking about my current research. These are some of the starting points, and I again have a picture here taken by my colleague. It is a picture about a trunk that used to belong to the family of my colleague. It was a trunk where all the belongings of the family were put during the Second World War when they had to flee and had to be evacuated elsewhere. And this family was not able to return, so they needed to move away from a region that was ceded to Soviet Union. So that trunk still continues to live. There isn't like anything related to the family history like left in there. There are other, maybe like newer, later objects that have been put there, but it is the trunk that kind of like tells the story of the family. And what is very interesting is that my colleague is writing an article about this trunk and how opening the trunk kind of like opens all the memories of the past. And also opening the trunk kind of like brings about new questions that my colleague might never get answers to, as her father who was Karelian descendants, has already passed away, and there's nobody like to respond except the trunk. And so that's kind of an interesting. I have a reference to this forthcoming article by my colleague later in the presentation. So personal and family memories, they anchor to material details and material objects. And often when people talk about certain material objects, they actually talk about something else. Not only about the object. They might talk about themselves or their descendants or for instance, care or love or something that they don't know how to put into words, or nobody knew how to put into words. So, and these memories about objects and materiality, they involve sensory and embodied layers, and these are not necessarily conscious or unconscious memory, but when people start to talk about the objects, or when they touch the object or show the object, they kind of like might remember things that they didn't know they remember. So, but these are extremely difficult to verbalize or articulate, and I think this is something that is highly interesting. Like when you interview people, and they don't really know how to describe some past experiences, then you need to pay attention to other things like silence and gestures and like the sight, how people, where do they look at, and these kinds of like embodied and affective things. And there isn't much literature in, let's say, some in communication studies, but in studies of history or anthropology or even like design, where you think one should really know how people feel when they like touch something. There isn't much study about like how people express this. And often, especially in business area, when people do studies about consumer experience, this is totally like irrelevant, even though it should be relevant. So I'm interested in this, how objects are, what kinds of things they trigger, so, and how we engage with them, and what kind of knowledge does that bring about. Another simple question. This was my like starting point when I built my research project that brought me here, also here to Chile, called Senso Mimo. The whole name is Material and Sensory Memories, Explorations on Autobiographical Materiality. So it's a 4-year project funded by Academy of Finland, where I have a research group of 3 researchers who work with me to study everyday entanglements with materiality and people-object relationships. So in this project we ask how emotion, sensory experience and memories intertwine in human-object relationships. And we also ask this methodological question of how can we study these engagements with objects, and how can we theorize upon this connection? What kinds of concepts we should use, what kinds of methods we should use when we want to know about these things. Should we interview, should we film, should we do something else? Our project started exactly that time when pandemic began, so we had a bold plan of doing like interviews. Well, my slide about the research materials comes later, but I'll explain this now. So we wanted to interview people or visit their homes and ask people to touch the important objects and show them to us. But suddenly we couldn't meet people, we couldn't go to their homes. So we began by doing a remote interviews. But then when we started interviewing people and we started to think about homes that we saw only through computer screen, we began interested in the kind of like realm of home, affective materiality of home, and how people like create a sense of home. So we've been concentrating a lot on sort of interior and well, sense of home is not only about materiality, it's also about like these kinds of like immaterial things. But we've asked people about their homes, and now we have begun to enter people's homes too. So we will have more research materials that actually are more ethnographic than the remote interviews. So when we talk about home, we are interested in how homes, how full of objects homes are, especially in the middle class. Like materiality is everywhere. People buy new things. This is really obvious when you look at kids' rooms. They're full of things, and there's an abundance really nowadays. And so we started looking at different categories and different meanings that objects have. So this is what we analyzed, like what kinds of objects do we have at home, and what are important and what are not. Then we are also interested in these temporal layers and home as biography. And we were inspired by Thomas's article about his grandmother's house. So, especially homes of elderly people, they are full of biographical objects. Almost everything there has a meaning, like special meaning, and that is somehow like connected to certain stages of life. But do all objects stay there, and what do the next generations do with them then? What do you do with the object that you inherit? This is a question that we all face at some point, and some people have to like all of a sudden face it, and all of a sudden when somebody dies, like accidentally for instance, you have to think about what do you do with all of the material things remaining. You also have to think about this if you lose your house, if you are forced to move, or if you choose to move. You also have to like choose what to take with you and what to leave. And some researchers like Maja Borsanowitz-Stryckman, a Swedish ethnologist, she studies that materiality and objects, they create continuity through place and time. Yes, that's important. But good question is what kinds of objects do this, and how do they do this? Not all objects are like that. We don't take all objects with us. There are certain objects that are important, and certain objects are given away. And they might be part of our life for a while at some situations, but then later they become useless, perhaps. And then in addition to objects, we also are interested in atmosphere. What is the atmosphere of home? How to create a home? What kinds of like dimensions, what kinds of elements we need? Shanti Sumartoja and Sarah Pink, who have studied the concept of atmosphere, they say that it is a combination of tangible, like physical elements, and then intangible, like abstract things. And it's curious how certain material things create certain abstract things. So they're totally connected. We cannot actually take them apart. So how do we make home if we need to? What kinds of things are important? This is something we ask, but we do not study those people who are sort of in vulnerable positions, who have now lost their home, because that would need a total like ethical evaluation and maybe a team that would take care of the mental health of these people. So we are concentrating on people who at some point of their life have had some kind of like major change. Not all of them, but we've learned that, for instance, in Finland, almost all families, they have in their background some kind of like change. So, and we do have some transnational families that we've interviewed who also have have history of forced displacement, so that's also there. And so what we did 12 online interviews, and now we are visiting these people. And we are visiting these participants' homes, and we called our kind of like method as bookshelf ethnography. So we go to the people's homes and we first ask them to choose what they want to show us. Then we also ask if we can look at their storage spaces or like terraces or basements or kitchen. Not everybody wants to do it, I can guarantee. And a lot of people, I guess, clean their house thoroughly before we come. We normally go as like 2 researchers in one place. We once had an interview with 3 of us, and that seemed to be really intimidating for the unknown person to let us enter his house. But he was a man who had a man cave. Man cave is kind of like a basement place where he did craft art, and he renovated things and like renovated old furniture, but also he made jewelry. That was his hobby. So he opened that space for us. 3 ladies got to visit the man cave. We clearly saw that he had cleaned it really nicely, but he had an amazing way of categorizing different tools and different materials, and he showed us his favorite tools. And it was a nice moment when he took a tool in his hand, as we could see that there were a lot of memories that this one tool brought about. So we have among our interviewees, we have like people of different age, we have men and women, and then we have one student too who has her first real home, her own home, and she wants to invite us there. So it's really interesting to see this. We also have an elderly couple who have moved away from their house and have now like a new home for the last years of their life. So we look at this, but these people are like more or less all middle class, since I could explain this a bit more, but let's say so Finland is a country that almost only has a huge middle class, so it's really equal, and people have really similar type of housing, really similar type of like way of life. It's not been like that always, but nowadays it is. So in Finland it's rather difficult to see differences really. And then in addition to this, as we were interested in like also individual objects, we decided to launch a call, like a writing request about objects. And it is such a request that people can submit a photo and then a written narrative of a photo. But if they want to be interviewed, they can also leave their like information. We did this together with a cultural institution called Finnish Literature Society, which is an institution that has the world's largest folklore archives, but also an archive of the everyday life experiences of Finnish people. So Finland has this long history of collecting oral histories among people. It relates to the time when Finnish language was not written, but more like an oral language. And we had a really rich epics in certain part of the country. And then a lot of students, university students, were sent, like from different like disciplines, they were sent to study these kinds of like areas and interview people. So we've got like thousands of hours of taped histories about old epics, but also about like old ways of life and also modern way of life and the clash between old and modern. So these kind of writing requests are kind of really common way of collecting information about everyday life. In addition, we also organized a few memory workshops at museums, and also one workshop for museum workers that could then later do these kinds of workshops, and we created a tool for that. And this happened kind of like as a coincidence. So here you see Finnish language cards, but my colleague Christina, who took also this photo, she had an idea when we do memory workshops and we ask people to bring an object and talk about it, we should have something there that enables them to talk about feelings and affects. So we created cards. You see cards of different colors, so they were like different layers. Pink, these are cards about emotions, so we put emotions in them. Then there are these yellow cards about sensory memories or sensory experiences. So there's like a card about touch, card about smells, like sounds, and that would enable people to talk about those things that they might not like directly start from. And then these purple cards, these are kind of more abstract words. These are kind of like cultural meanings or shared meanings. So here we got, for instance, like transgenerational relations or generations, home, care, festivity, everyday life, work, such things. And so people can then choose. We give them first the emotion cards and then the sensory cards, and while people like hold on these cards and leave them through, they begin to talk, and they are in a small group and they share their memories. And we have videotaped these memory workshops, and now we have a master student to kind of like transcribe these films and what is happening there. And what we see that when we first saw through the film, of course in situ that you cannot pay attention too much if you leave this kind of workshop, but we saw that people would like sit next to each other and lean like towards each other, and they would laugh and cry even, and a lot of people like seem to like express a lot of emotions, not only like in their narratives but also embodied like with their bodies and gestures. And it seems that these kinds of workshops create empathy between people. So if somebody shares a memory of a certain object, other people start to talk about similar objects and similar experiences. And for instance, in this small example, there's a ring as an object of memory. And so that group of 3 people, they talked about all kinds of memories related to jewelry, and really emotional. We also asked people to write shortly about that story that they want to share. But of course, writing is just one thing, and then talking and telling and sharing with somebody else is another. We've got maximum 12 participants in these workshops, so we've got like groups of 3 people, and it is a challenge to film them since we need to film a group, have one group and one tape and so on. So this is a rather complicated way of collecting research material, but really interesting. And then we always ask feedback from these sessions, and we also have developed these cards and like added new things to them. So we will write an article about using these cards and about how the touching of the card, what kind of like reactions it makes. So here are a few of the forthcoming publications. That card article is still really under it's like sketching, so we don't yet know where it goes and what to do with it. But we are about to publish this year maybe this book, edited volume called Reconstructing Home, Affective Materiality and Atmospheres of Belonging, that is already received preliminary acceptance to Barry the Berghaus Material Mediation series. So there will be an edited volume, and then I'm writing about clutter and layering of everyday life with my colleague Anna Kajander, and then Christina that I mentioned earlier, who owns the trunk, she's already written this article that will be published in this edited volume, Displaced Families, Displaced Memories. So I like the title very much, Knowing with the Trunk. So she's looking at how this trunk triggers these transgenerational memories. And there will be more, but these are the ones that are already on paper. And then in the end, I will talk just shortly about another project that I'm involved with. Just to mention that affects can also be part of like constructive environment and buildings. So I'm a member of a project called Smokestack Memories, where we study future and reuse of industrial heritage. So we study people's memories and experiences of former industrial sites that are now either abandoned or in new use, or some of them have been turned into like galleries or something. So we ask memories of them, but also about experiences of them in today's context. This is led by archaeologist Tiina Äikäs at the University of Oulu in north of Finland, and in that project there has been maybe like 50 interviews already by now. It's a large project group that also has 2 PhD students working on different issues. And then we also have launched a web page, like an application where people can tag or spot an industrial site, add a picture and a narrative about the site. And they can leave their information if they want us to visit the site with them or something. So this is called muistotkartalla.fi. It's again Finnish language, so it is like memories on the map. That's how it looks, and that is kind of a simple thing. It's created by a group of information technology students of the University of Oulu, and they keep like kind of developing it according to feedback all the time. So then we do also place-based art. So one artist, Suvi Nurmi, who's a kind of like author and an artist, will be doing word art. So taking parts of interviews and also these narratives that people share through this crowdsourcing site, online site, and she will create place-based art performances that will be brought to that actual site, and so people can then go and experience them there, close to the smokestacks of factories and factory areas. That's an interesting thing. We also study like urban exploring and all kinds of other activities happening at these sites. As archaeologists that I work with do contemporary archaeology, so they're interested in contemporary phenomena and connections with the material environment of the past. So that's about it. Here's a short bibliography. I would have a longer one too, but just to mention a few that inspired us, or that we started from. And then in the end, if you're interested in visiting some Instagram, especially like images, Sensomimo and also Smokestack Memories, that is the other one, have an active Instagram page. Smokestack Memories Instagram pages is maybe more active even, because industrial heritage is all over, so when researchers move about they spot a lot of like interesting things. In different cities, we also have images from other like European cities and Canada, where one of our researchers was just visiting as a visiting professor. So. But this piippumuistoja is also in Finnish, even though all our research is basically in English. Thank you.
Thank you.